Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining another episode of Inman Instudio. I'm Lauren Walker, Senior Director of Strategy at Inman, and today I am so excited to sit down with Marci Rossell, who is Chief Economist of leading real estate companies of the world. Marci, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today.
Thank you, Lauren. I've been saying over and over again, I'm really happy to be here. I wish the circumstances were different,
Yes.
and I know they will be one day. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, your insight and your expertise is exactly what we needed today because it's a very simple question with a not simple answer. What's next? What happens next? What do we do? What are we going to know? And so I'm so grateful you're here, and I know our audience will be too. So let's just dive right into it, shall we? Can you kind of talk us through, what is the impact of COVID-19 kind of from the global perspective as soon as it started to today? What have you seen?
Well, I have guided people through this crisis by keeping in mind that there are really three channels at work economically.
Hmm.
So this is a healthcare crisis, a shock that's coming from outside of the economy and having an economic impact, which is unlike any other crisis we've ever seen.
Right.
Most economic crises have economics, something like the housing market or the
Mhm.
stock market or a bubble in some sort of financial market at the root, and then it emanates out from there. This is something coming from totally outside the economy. It's a healthcare crisis, and we should sort of think about it almost like a natural disaster. And then the effects of the economy happen through three channels. The first effect is through income, where people lose their jobs. Businesses have to close because of physical distancing measures in an effort to basically get the healthcare crisis to a controllable, manageable level. So that's the income channel. And that's the one we've really been focused on for the past 3 months. That's the one when you talk about job loss,
Yeah.
unemployment, GDP, that's the immediate income loss. The second economic impact comes from a loss of wealth. This is when the stock market declines, the value of assets decline. Typically, most of us are concerned with the value of our home. I know we're going to talk a lot about how home and the housing market is acting very differently in this crisis than it did in 2008, 2009. We'll talk
Mhm.
about why. This has primarily been through a loss of wealth that's come through a decline in stock prices. Additionally, the stock market declined globally about 30%. Currently, we're down worldwide anywhere from 10 to 15%, depending on the market that you're looking at. So that's income, that's wealth. But then there's a third channel, and it's the one that you alluded to. It's the uncertainty of what the road looks like going forward. And these are the three main ways that the economy is impacted. And it helps us get some sort of framework when we're talking about these things. So it's not this just big,
Yeah.
amorphous, huge, forces that we can't really understand. Coming back every time to those three things helps us analyze what happens moving forward.
Yeah, that really does give it a framework to think of. Can you talk me through where have you seen the biggest impact? Are there markets that have taken a bigger hit or are actually performing better? What have you seen?
Well, it's important to keep in mind that in this crisis, it seems as if two things matter. And I don't care if you're talking about an individual, a company, or a geography. It matters whether or not you've got cash flow.
Yep.
Again, that's the income. And it matters whether or not you have savings, and that's the wealth, right? So savings is tied to your wealth, income is tied to your cash flow. And so any individual who's either got cash flow or plenty of savings can ride this out. If
Mhm.
you're a company and you've either got cash flow or you've got savings stored up, you can ride this out. If you're a country and you either have cash flow that's coming from your GDP or you don't have a whole lot of government debt, you can probably ride this out. So when I think about the occupations that have been hit so hard from an employment perspective,
Mhm.
if you're in an occupation that's high touch, right? So that tends to be hospitality, entertainment, anything like that that's person to person contact, your cash flow is going to be impacted.
Right.
And unfortunately, we know that your average American, particularly if you're in a low income quartile, probably doesn't have a lot of savings, probably doesn't have enough savings to pay for a month or even two of expenses. Now, some of that has been mitigated by generous unemployment benefits, stimulus checks, all of those things to help ameliorate the income loss from all of
Mm-hmm.
this. So depending on what you're sort of talking about, this is not what we call a homogeneous shock. It doesn't affect everyone in exactly the same way, depending on your occupation, the industry you're in. So some industries have done really, really well.
Right.
Amazon, big box stores, if you are, the central banks worldwide have been adding staff. So, but if you're in the hospitality industry, you've probably lost your job at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So it really does all depend. And that's important to keep in mind when we start analyzing housing markets. Not every housing market is going to respond in the same way to this crisis. Some places will probably do really, really well a year down the road. Some places are going to suffer.
Right, right. That brings to mind the saying I've heard over and over that, we're not all in the same boat, but we are in the same storm. And that really resonates, as what you're describing.
Yeah.
How would you compare this to the other economic disasters we've been in? You started to allude to this. We've got the Great Depression, we've got the housing recession, we've got post 9/11. What are we looking at? What can we learn?
Sure. Well, the 2008, 2009 is the one that I think a lot of real estate professionals and a lot of people in general sort of harken back to as a similar event.
Mm-hmm.
It's not at all. Like I said before, that 2008, 2009 was a shock that began in the housing market and then spread throughout the economy. This is a shock coming from the outside that's having secondary economic impacts. And so what was so hard about the housing crisis and the sort of the boom and subsequent bust was that it turned into a financial crisis. The Federal Reserve this time around was determined not to let that happen again. Mm-hmm. So what we saw was there was no sort of discussion, consideration, should we provide liquidity to markets? Should we engage in quantitative easing? They just did it instantly. And they did it to prevent a liquidity crisis from becoming a solvency crisis. So for students of the Great Depression, one of the things that was crucial there was that the drought, which was the external cause of the Great Depression, originally the external cause of the downturn, became much, much worse because the Federal Reserve at the time was unwilling to support the banking system. So when the loans started to go bad in the agriculture sector, which back then was much, much larger, banks began to fail, and the federal government said, you know what, we're not going to help you out. And so remember the bank runs from It's a Wonderful Life? That's probably a movie some of us, my vintage, would remember. But banks began to fail, and it was this domino effect where a liquidity crisis became a solvency crisis. And so the difference this time around is that central banks worldwide moved in to prevent a financial crisis from magnifying and making things much, much worse.
Okay, so we're not in a crisis as of this moment.
It's a healthcare crisis. It's a healthcare crisis. And if you lost your job, it is definitely a crisis for you. So that's something, but it's not a financial crisis, right? A financial crisis in the sense of what happened during the Great Depression and what happened in the aftermath of the failure of Lehman Brothers in the fall of 2008. So that's what I mean by it's not the same kind of domino effect crisis where the failure of one institution leads to the failure of another institution, and suddenly you have people not trusting the banking system any longer. Okay. That's what I mean by it's not the same kind of crisis.
Thank you for clarifying that. So is it a recession though? That's kind of the buzzword that people are listening for. So is this a recession, or are we heading that way?
Well, a recession is defined, and I always think definitions are super important, as 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP growth, right? So that means you need the economy to be contracting for 6 solid months. So given that this is a speedy downturn, the deepest, quickest downturn we've ever experienced, followed by a return to something that looks like a new normal, and I'm not big on cliches, but I think that one's so appropriate. We're not going to get back to anything that looks like before. It will be something new. So you're going to see a sharp rebound in economic activity. So technically, it's possible that there's no technical recession, but I don't think technically it matters. A downturn of probably about 20% by the time it's all over with. If you look at the magnitude of how far economic activity will fall in a really short period of time, unemployment rates in double digits, even if they're for a short period of time, you may skirt a technical recession, but I don't think those kind of words matter for us right now. I think what more people are concerned about is, does this drag on for years and years and years?
Yes.
And I think that's what people are more concerned with, rather than is it a technical recession or not? I don't know that matters. I don't need those words to know this is really, really bad stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, on that note, what does 2021 look like in what you're seeing? What do you think?
Well, again, it depends on the industry you're in. It depends on the occupation you're in. It depends on the geography. So let's sort of take each one of those in turn. What has to happen is that there will be a reallocation of economic activity away from high touch, leisure oriented occupations, industries, into something completely different. So we've already seen people adjust their vacation plans.
Yes.
So instead of taking a big family vacation on a plane to Disney, I'm going to go camping instead. There's an organization called Camping World. The first week of May was their biggest week in the company's entire history.
Wow.
So that's what I mean by a reallocation. So it isn't that people won't spend money, but they're going to spend money in very, very different ways. So geographically, we know one of the most hard hit places on the whole planet is New York City.
Yes.
As leases expire, you're going to see people in the hospitality industry, the entertainment industry, the film industry not be able to stay in New York City any longer. And so it doesn't happen automatically. Those people leave very, very slowly as leases expire, and they will move out into urban areas with a similar culture, but with a much lower cost of living. So you're going to see that movement out of those big metropolitan areas, a slow trickle out probably over the next 2 years into metropolitan areas that are less dense and that are less expensive, coupled with a lot of industries that are saying, hey, we don't want you to ever come back into the office. Twitter is a great example, right? So people moving to working from home permanently, understanding that the commercial space that's going to be needed will be much, much smaller than it has been in the past. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation, so to speak.
Yes.
So I think you're going to see some real estate markets, the second home market, where people can get away within driving distance of their primary home, is going to become very, very attractive, as we've realized, there's a possibility that there might be a second wave in the fall. I don't want to be caught flat-footed in my 600 square foot urban apartment. I need a place where I can go and homeschool my kids and have outdoor space and have a big kitchen. So there are markets that will do really, really well in the months to come as we sort of shuffle through this reallocation of economic resources to something that's new.
That's really, really powerful. So you've given us a framework for how to think of all of this. So let's bring this back to our audience right here, right now, and talk to them a little bit about, as businesses are reopening their doors, quite literally and figuratively, how do they talk to their clients about buying and selling homes?
I think from a branding perspective, the most important thing is to be perceived as safe. It's extremely important. And I can relate that from economic research. We all know worldwide, people have made a lot of there've been a lot of discussions around the experience of Sweden and how Sweden didn't put into place really strong government mandated physical distancing orders. Right across the water is Denmark, that had a very different government response. So two economies look very similar sizes, and two different government responses to the pandemic. There was a researcher at the University of Copenhagen who looked at spending patterns in the two countries, and despite the different government response, the spending patterns were the same.
Wow.
What we can gather from that is that we've made a lot of hay in this country, in the US, around different states putting different orders into place and how those different orders can give you a different economic outcome. It's not going to matter going forward what governments do. What matters is how safe people feel. So it didn't matter what the Swedish government did. The people in Sweden took an approach and spent their money differently, basically in the same way that Danish people did, in response to this. So we can learn from that and say, it doesn't matter what governments tell us we should or shouldn't be doing. What matters is how our customers feel and their perception of how safe things are. So that's job one as we get back to business. It isn't just following the letter of the law, it's the spirit of how safe people feel. That's the first thing. And the second thing is to understand that people are going to be looking for something different from their square footage. So you might propose a large open plan home with a huge kitchen. In the past, you would have said, this is a great place to entertain 50 of your closest friends. That is not what's going to sell that kitchen now. This is a great place to homeschool your kids, do a nice Zoom call, over here in your Zoom room, and put a Peloton bike over here in this corner right here. So the sales approach is going to be different because in the back of people's minds, there is the possibility that we could be right back here, possibly in 6 months. Whether or not that's true from an epidemiology point of view, I have no idea.
Yeah.
But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about how people will feel. And anyone who's out there in this business knows that how people feel is what's going to motivate their home buying decisions going forward.
That's for sure. Wow. Well, thank you, Marci. This has been fantastic information for our audience to be able to think through what this experience has meant to them, to their business, and how to look at going forward. So thank you so much for that insight.
Thank you for having me.